Remember Arianism? That was the heresy that was swirling around the late 200s and early 300s, propagated by the Alexandrian cleric Arius. The First Council of Nicaea ruled in 325 that Arianism was a heresy and sent Arius into exile. If you listen to episode 149, you may recall that Arianism didn't go away after the Council of Nicaea. The bishops went home and found that Arianism was so entrenched in their churches, particularly in the East, that they caved under the pressure and many stopped resisting Arianism. And a couple of bishops, like Eusebius of Nicomedia, were actually closet Arians to begin with and had no intention of implementing what was decided at the Council of Nicaea. When Theodosius I ascended the throne of the Eastern Roman Empire, he made Nicene, or Trinitarian Christianity, the official religion of the Roman Empire, and he did everything in his power to expel Arianism from the Eastern churches. Some abandoned their Arian beliefs, some fled the empire, and after the Council of Constantinople in 381, Arianism seemed to fizzle out. Well, at least in the Roman Empire. However, that was not the end of Arianism in parts of Europe where Arian Christians had fled. They mixed in with nomadic tribes, and Arian Christianity began to grow in places like modern-day Germany and France. Over the years, these nomadic tribes full of Arian Christians began attacking Rome, little by little, weakening the city one invasion at a time. Eventually, on September 4th, 476, Odovacar, a barbarian general from the Middle Danube, captured Rome's 10-year-old emperor named Romulus Augustus and sent him into exile. This is considered the fall of the Roman Empire. Here we thought Arianism was done, and yet it was Arian Christians that ultimately led to the fall of Rome. Hi, my name is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. This is part 8 of our series on the 21 Ecumenical Church Councils, which began in episode 146. Today we're going to examine the 5th Ecumenical Council, the Second Council of Constantinople. Before we continue, I'd like to express my gratitude for joining me today on Why Catholic. I really appreciate those of you who have left positive comments on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as on my social media channels. And speaking of social media, I've been doing short 90-second videos related to this series on the Ecumenical Councils. You can find those on my Instagram channel, Why Catholic Podcast, all one word, as well as on my Why Catholic YouTube channel and my Facebook page. Links for those are in the show notes. Let me also give a special shout out to those of you who are financial supporters of Why Catholic. If you have benefited from this podcast, I would love for you to join the special group of patrons that keeps this podcast going. Think of it like buying me a cup of coffee once a month with a lot more benefits than just a cup of coffee. You can learn more about supporting this podcast in the links in the show notes. Today, we're going to focus on 4 areas that cover about 100 years from 451 to 553. We'll start with the aftermath of the Council of Chalcedon in 451, the fall of the Roman Empire, the rise of the Byzantine Empire, and then the Second Council of Constantinople of 553. And because I really try to abide by the TED Talk rule, I'm going to attempt to cover all of this in around 17 minutes. If you'd like to dive deeper into this history, there's lots of links in the show notes. Let's begin with the aftermath of the Council of Chalcedon. If you recall from the last 2 episodes, the major debate among Christians during the 5th century was on the nature of Jesus, also known as Christology. Nestorius claimed that Jesus had not only 2 natures, human and divine, but that he was like 2 separate people. I like to use the analogy of 2 people in a horse costume. This was known as Nestorianism. After Nestorianism was condemned by the Council of Ephesus, Eutychus tried to distance himself so far from Nestorianism that he took its polar opposite extreme and claimed that Jesus was one unified person with one unified nature. This was known as monophysitism. The Council of Chalcedon condemned monophysitism and articulated that Jesus was one person with 2 distinct natures. He was fully human and fully divine. This theological concept is known as the hypostatic union. Put that in your back pocket if you're ever on Jeopardy! Like we've seen with every other council, the theological divisions don't just end after the council makes its decision. After the Council of Ephesus, the Nestorians broke away and started what would become known as the Assyrian Church in the East. Likewise, the Council of Chalcedon ended up causing an even larger schism, particularly in Egypt and Syria. These became known as non-Chalcedonian or monophysite churches because they rejected the ruling made at the Council of Chalcedon and the 2 natures of Jesus. In reality, these groups, many still exist today as Oriental Orthodox churches, prefer to be called Miaphysite churches. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to use the term monophysites. We'll come back to the schism in just a minute, but let's turn our attention to what was happening in Rome. As I mentioned at the start of the episode, Rome was facing constant invasions from barbarian tribes. In fact, the ruthless barbarian ruler Attila the Hun came right up to Rome's doorsteps, but thanks to some mysterious events involving Pope Leo the Great, Attila the Hun just left peacefully. If you want to hear more about that story, check out episode 113 on the Great Popes. Eventually, in 476, the last emperor, Augustus Romulus, would be sent into exile, an event that historians have dubbed as the fall of the Roman Empire. This also marks the beginning of what historians call the medieval or Middle Ages, or you may have even heard the outdated term, the Dark Ages. This marked a time of depression in Western Europe. Rome would limp along as a vassal state ruled by various barbarian leaders, while the lack of a true Roman emperor forced the Pope to act as both the head of the church and the governor of Rome. If you want to hear about some of the ingenious things Pope Gregory did to keep Rome from a total collapse, I also talked about this in episode 113 on the Great Popes. Some historians take umbrage with claiming that the Roman Empire fell in 476 because there, of course, was still the Eastern Roman Empire, which very much did not fall. In fact, it entered its golden era during this time. The capital of Constantinople managed to ward off external threats by paying tributes to would-be invaders and fortifying its walls. This sent invading armies towards Rome and eased the pressure off the East. Economically speaking, Constantinople became a major global hub fueled by trade. It standardized currency, implemented tax reforms, and it invested in infrastructure. And Constantinople really led the charge in trying to not only advance its political empire, but to do so through religious unity. When Zeno became the Eastern Roman Emperor in 474, he wanted to mend the schism between the Catholic Orthodox Church and the non-Chalcedonian churches, or the Monophysite churches that we talked about earlier. In an effort to try and bridge the divide, Zeno published the Henoticon in 482 with the assistance of the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Henoticon, which is Greek for Act of Union, was meant to be a unifying Christological statement that affirmed the Councils of Nicaea, Constantinople I, and Ephesus, but steered clear of declaring whether Jesus had one nature or two. He was hoping this would appease the Monophysites, but instead it backfired big time. Both the Chalcedonian and the Monophysite churches hated it, and it deepened the divide between Rome and Constantinople. While the Eastern Roman Empire failed to bring church unity, it did thrive in other ways. In fact, the 6th century would be considered its golden era, ushered in by the Emperor Justinian, great name by the way, who began his rule in 527. Many historians differentiate between the old Eastern Roman Empire and the empire led by Justinian by referring to it as the Byzantine Empire. The way I like to think of it is Roman Empire Beta began with Caesar Augustus, Roman Empire 2.0 was ushered in by Constantine in the 4th century, and Roman Empire 3.0 was launched by Justinian. Even though many call it the Byzantine Empire, it was still very much the Roman Empire. In fact, Justinian sought to return the Roman Empire to its former glory. To do this, Justinian launched military campaigns against the barbarian tribes to reconquer lost lands in the West, including Rome and Italy, North Africa, and even as far west as Spain. He overhauled the legal reform with the Corpus Juris Civilis, a massive codification of Roman law that shaped Western legal systems for centuries, influencing everything from property rights to contracts. And Justinian went on a building spree, including the construction of what would be the world's largest cathedral for ages, the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Justinian, like certain previous emperors, saw a unified and thriving Christianity to be key to a unified and thriving empire, and he took this to a whole new level. He persecuted non-Christians throughout the empire, and he involved himself in theologically nuanced debates among Christians. In 543, Justinian led the efforts to anathemize Origen, the church father who lived in the 250s, 300 years prior to Justinian. Indeed, Origen had some fringe ideas about Christian doctrine, but he also had some very influential Orthodox opinions as well, and he died a martyr. In reality, the anathemization of Origen wasn't really about Origen, but about some monks who had taken some of Origen's borderline ideas to whole different levels. Then in 544, Justinian anathemized what's considered as the 3 chapters, certain writings by Theodore of Mopsuestia, Theodoret, and Ebus. He claimed that these individuals leaned towards Nestorianism. However, that isn't really quite the case. In fact, some of their writings were praised at the Council of Chalcedon. The issue was more that the Monophysites didn't exactly like them, and they didn't like them because they leaned towards the two-nature version of Christ, but with an Antiochian flair or school of thought. If you want to actually read their writings, I've included these in the show notes. It's helpful to recognize how polarizing of a time this was. If someone wasn't on one side of things, everyone would accuse them of being on the opposite extreme. Think about our political landscape for a second. Political parties and ideologies have become so polarized that if you express pro-life views, for example, people assume you must be a raging right-wing fascist. Or if you express concerns about climate change, you must be a woke left-wing liberal. That was kind of like the religious climate of the 6th century. The Monophysites accused these 3 chapters of being in the opposite Nestorian camp, even though they really weren't. And because Justinian sought to unify Christianity, he was willing to appease the Monophysites and anathemize these 3 chapters. Not everyone agreed with Justinian, particularly the Pope at the time named Vigilius. He felt that anathemizing the 3 chapters really undermined the Council of Chalcedon because they and their writings were praised at Chalcedon. What would stop Justinian from taking aim at other writings from the Council of Chalcedon, like Pope Leo's famous tome, or even anathemizing the entire council? This also shows the theological schools of thought entrenched in the West and the East. In the West, they held to a solid two-nature Christology. In Constantinople, however, they were also in the two-nature Christological camp, but much more open to monophysitism. Pope Vigilius eventually excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople for taking things too far. Side note, I mentioned earlier how I'm doing these short reels on social media that highlight bits and pieces of this series. One of the reels I did was on what led to the Great Schism of 1054. We'll eventually get to the Great Schism in this series, but if you've been following along, hopefully you can see the perpetual tension between Rome and Constantinople. People often think that the Great Schism was this radical event where the Pope in Rome excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople. No, that happened quite a number of times, and it wasn't just the Pope excommunicating the Patriarch of Constantinople. It definitely went both ways. Pope Vigilius' excommunication was just one instance in a long history of excommunications. Pope Vigilius was under a lot of pressure to condemn the 3 chapters from Constantinople, and so he reluctantly did. But he was careful not to condemn the whole Council of Chalcedon, even though that was ultimately what the Monophysites wanted. His decision to condemn the 3 chapters, however, backfired. It was so unpopular in the West that some North African bishops even excommunicated Vigilius for it. Emperor Justinian and Pope Vigilius passed secret letters back and forth, planning on how they could change the minds of the bishops in the West and convene an ecumenical council. Eventually, in 545, the Byzantine forces in Rome arrested Pope Vigilius and forced him to go to Constantinople. However, on the way there, he had a stint in Sicily for a year or 2. Vigilius would stay in Constantinople all the way through the Second Council of Constantinople in 553, meaning there wasn't a pope living in Rome for over a decade. Let's fast forward to 553 and around the time of the Second Council of Constantinople, and let's talk about our 3 major players. Pope Vigilius was living in Constantinople. Eutychius was the Patriarch of Constantinople, and Justinian was the Byzantine Emperor. Justinian really wanted to convene this church council. Pope Vigilius initially agreed and also voiced his support for Eutychius to lead the council. Justinian summoned an equal number of bishops from all 5 patriarchates, Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, and by doing so ensured that there were more Eastern bishops present than Western bishops. Of the 152 bishops present, only 16 were from the West, and none were from Italy. However, leading up to the beginning of the council in May 5th, 553, Pope Vigilius decided that he wasn't supportive of it and decided not to attend. He could have been the first pope to attend an ecumenical council. He was even living in the very city where the council was taking place, but he still didn't attend. Emperor Justinian kicked off the council with a lengthy and detailed summary of events that led everyone to that moment. And he noted that Pope Vigilius originally condemned the 3 chapters, but that he later refused to attend any synods or councils. He really called him out there. With Pope Vigilius missing in action, the council proceeded without him. They summoned him, and after he refused to appear, they called for his arrest. Pope Vigilius and his allies fled to the church in Chalcedon, where the Council of Chalcedon was held 100 years prior. Justinian responded by releasing all the secret correspondences between him and Pope Vigilius. It was like the medieval version of WikiLeaks. This wasn't a good look for Vigilius. If you were a Western Christian, you could see how he was conspiring with Emperor Justinian to try and get the Westerners to condemn the 3 chapters. Vigilius was really trying to play both sides, and ultimately, it just backfired. At the end of the day, the council voted to anathemize the 3 chapters, as well as the 3rd century theologian Origen. This was the first ecumenical council up to this point that didn't deal with any new heresy. And unlike the previous ecumenical councils, this council didn't list any administrative canons. It just listed 29 anathemas. 14 included statements of support for the 4 previous councils and creeds, as well as condemnation of the 3 chapters. And the final 15 were anathemas against Origen. An anathema is quite different than probably what we're used to hearing. Instead of "this is what we believe," it puts it in the negative. For example, anathema 10 states, quote, "If anyone does not confess that our Lord Jesus Christ, who is crucified in the flesh, is true God and the Lord of glory, and one of the Holy Trinity, let him be anathema," end quote. So in one sense, it states the theological position of the council, but does so kind of in a backhanded way. Now, in order to have an ecumenical council, the Pope has to sign off on it. It didn't look like that was going to happen in this case. However, in December of 553, some 6 months after the council had concluded, Pope Vigilius sent a letter to Patriarch Eutychius, finally deciding to ratify the Second Council of Constantinople. A couple of months later, he sent a letter to the Western bishops notifying them of his decision to condemn the 3 chapters. However, there was an immense fallout from this council. On one hand, many in the West considered Justinian to be a tyrant, particularly because he had initiated invasions to reconquer lands that had fallen into barbarian rule. On the other hand, Western bishops were irate with Pope Vigilius' decision, and so a number of dioceses decided to break communion with Rome. This will set the stage for a tumultuous century in church history, which will ultimately lead to the Third Council of Constantinople. Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.